So hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Programming Conditioning for Field and Court Sports Using Muscle Oxygen Sensors, presented by Aaron Davis from Train Adapt Evolve. This is a presentation that Aaron gave at Trinity University this past weekend at a sports conference they held there. We've got about a 30-minute presentation today. We'll stop about halfway for a short Q&A break like we normally do, and then we'll have a longer Q&A break at the end. Aaron may also take some questions as they come up during the event, so you can go ahead and type your questions in. We are using a new webinar software for this event than we've used in the past, so the interface is a little bit different. You still have a panel on the right side. It's called the meeting chat panel, and that's where you can type in your questions if you have any over there. And just go ahead and type your questions in as we go. If we don't have time to get to all of them in the event today, we can follow up afterwards with written answers to the questions. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send it out to all the attendees as a link as soon as we get it posted, and we usually get it posted within about a day after the event. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Aaron, and I think Aaron can start sharing his screen for the presentation, and we'll go from there.
All right.
That looks like it's working.
And actually, Roger, I probably won't even be able to see the questions as they come up. I don't have that panel on the right side, so just.
Okay, I'll monitor those and let you know.
All right. Well, guys, thanks for joining today, and also thanks for Roger for having me. As the title says, conditioning for field and court sport athletes, and insights from muscle oximetry. So now the title always grabs people because they always think, oh, wow, he's going to go over all the workouts and the protocols and all the stuff. And though we'll touch on it, I would say that the main objective of this talk is to give you an idea how to look at Moxy and how it's implemented, and how does it fit with all these other variables when it comes to field and court sport athletes. And so just a little background. I started about 10 or 12 years ago in coaching, and the majority of my time I've spent really just coaching sprinters or kind of speed and power type athletes. I come from an endurance background, but here's the holy grail of kind of strength and conditioning, is to try to pair up both the conditioning aspect with also enhancing the variables of max velocity in sprinting, jumping, strength, power, etc. Now, it's one thing of just having athletes being conditioned. Now, that's great. You can have tanks out there, but you need Ferraris, right? So even in the and just the example of just soccer, right? We know that the guys that can sprint very fast in a straight line, can usually create space and can score the ball. So we have to try to meld all these ideas of training and strength conditioning together so that we can actually make an athlete that can do everything well, okay? And so as I kind of go through this, right, we're going to first start off just kind of what kind of hit me in the face when we first started using Moxy. And this was recommended, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago by Landon Evans, who may be on this already. And I was thinking lactate was all the rage, right? And that's the one way I can monitor, right? And the science leading up to lactate at that time was I would say strong. There's been a couple books out that was leading me in that direction. And the same old paradigm that's been taught to us about energetics was, mainstream. And so that's what I went with. It wasn't until I started using Moxy with my athletes that it just, everything's great until you kind of get punched in the face. And that's what happened. And all of a sudden we started seeing stuff that was not like what was written down in the textbooks that we studied all those years back. Or to be honest, is what's even written sometimes today. And so we would get graphs that would show, even when we did high intensity exercise, we would see that O2 would be used immediately. And then when the athlete recovered, you would see it come back up, okay? Now, this was completely against what we would see from a traditional model. What's also great is that with the Moxy, it allows us to see certain metrics that we can improve. Now, I know the THB here, which always throws people off, there's a little bit of a venous and arterial occlusioning happening here, but let's just forget about that right now. And just look at the idea of this in the sense that we can now look at utilization. We can have timestamps to utilization, right? So this is a 20-second go. The athlete was holding their breath a little bit longer, so you can see O2 being utilized a little bit afterwards. But ultimately, we can see time stamps of how long does it take somebody to utilize. And most importantly, we can see the timestamps of recovery. Now, why does this matter for field and sport court athletes? Well, at the end of the day, we want athletes that can be very fast, recover, and express that same intensity again, and again. Now, and a lot of our consulting that we end up doing for various teams, even now when it comes to basketball, we know that when we do our high intensity test on them, the athletes that recover the fastest are generally the ones that are playing the most. Now, some would say, well, is it just the training that's happening, right? Is it the training that the coach is doing? It's probably more of a function of how they've had to survive that environment to become good and to be where they're at. So if we even look at the basketball season, and this is the reason why I think Moxy is really important when it comes to a practical use for these type of athletes, is that they're always doing their sport. They're literally playing basketball games all year long, right? And the people that have probably the best physiology and skill will rise to the top. They're going to be injury-free, right? And so generally we know that if in the NCAA, at least the couple teams that we've been able to test so far, we know that you need to usually recover after a high-intensity session or a high-intensity interval within under 70 seconds, right? Generally, we'd like to see under 60 seconds or something like kind of the top guys. When we look at teams that we consult with that don't have those profiles, right, we see maybe a little bit more injury, a little bit less playing time, but spread out between all the players. And all those things, if we can improve, then they can express their skill longer, recover, and hopefully be better at their sport. Another metric that we can also look at is what the gas tank is. We always talk about this as being the gas tank. We look at how full is the gas tank. Now here, we're looking around about 65% as a high, and then how much can they empty their gas tank? And we're looking about right around 19 or 20%. And I always tell this to coaches. If I sold you a car and you can only fill it up to about 3/4 of a tank, and you could only drive it to about 1/4 of a tank, and it would just quit and pull off to the side of the road, you probably wouldn't want to buy that car. And you'd be really pissed off at me for even selling you that car. And so I think when we have these metrics, we can then come up with ideas on how can we improve the resting SMO2, or how can a warm-up improve the resting SMO2, right? And consistently get it at those values that we want. And how can the athlete utilize that last 1/4 of a tank, okay? These are things that Moxy allows us to see, and then we can devise ideas on how to improve. Now, when we look at these field and court sport athletes, generally we like to see in the 80s or above, right? Generally, if I see like 95 or above, sometimes that's not necessarily good. And when I see 90 or 95%, generally it's not in field or court sport athletes, it's usually in the endurance types. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. But a main objective or priority then would just to be, how can we increase the gas tank, and how can we use it all before the athlete fatigues? So here is the traditional model that we all have seen probably over and over and over again. And I think we can tear it apart now. I think it's probably to the point where it doesn't give us anything when it comes to a model to train our athletes, because even in the sense that alactic period, Alactic, we know that lactate is being produced at all times. You guys probably sitting in front of your computers right now, listening to this, you're producing lactate. It's a general function. In fact, if lactate wasn't even being produced in the brain, you would probably just be going into a coma right now. Not necessarily just from me talking. And then we go to the next one, anaerobic. We know that the cell never is without oxygen. It generally always has some kind of oxygen tension in the cell. And then when we look at the aerobic side, we have to kind of pick on it in the sense that the aerobic side shows that you can only use the aerobic with low end power. But in reality, we know that if we even trace back to we know that performance, as you utilize, performance can keep on increasing, but once the utilization gets to its basement or to its bottom value or to that empty gas tank, which what is specific to that athlete, performance starts going bye-bye, or it can only hold for just a little bit. And so then that kind of turns that on its head as well. So how we need to look at energetics is the fact that PCR, phosphocreatine, is our energetic priority. So when we look at glycogenolysis, glycolysis, and oxidation, it's all about trying to fill up the PCR pools. Glycogenolysis might be new for some, but if we start looking at even how does a twitch end up getting its energy, it's mostly from glycogen, right? Because the twitches happen at too fast of an interval. And it's also interesting is that glycogenolysis can give us just a little bit more ATP than glycolysis, right? So it's a reason for one when we think of nutrition and everything else, especially with speed and power athletes. We always need to keep that in mind. So our priority is to fill up the PCR pools. So the payoff. Why does this make sense? And even from the standpoint of going against the traditional model, we know that the payoff on oxidation is 36 ATP. So if we want to do a lot of work, a lot of intense and powerful work, well, I want to use where the energy is coming from. I need a lot of energy to create that kind of power. And that's why oxidation is key in some of those terms. And as you can see here, that ATP that's being generated is going to phosphorylate creatine to make phosphocreatine, and that phosphocreatine will then give a phosphate to ADP to make ATP. And then if we look at fatigue studies, we can see that ATP generally stays above 90%, right? But what you see going out is the PCR pools going down. And there's a lot of different things and ways we can look at this too, is that, and we'll talk about it even more here in a bit, but just the fact that when PCR goes down, we also know that membrane potential goes down. When membrane potential goes down in a cell, we know potassium starts leaving the cell and sodium starts infiltrating the cell. And then when we think of just fatigue in general from a biochemical perspective, if the ions are in chaos, then generally that cell cannot work. So if we have good PCR and good ATP, which that's kind of a given, I guess, in a sense, of above 90%, if we have good PCR being replenished, then generally the structure of the cell will stay in a way that we could label it as the ready state. When the cell is in a ready state, it then can be used, all right? So that's why when we think of oxidation as giving us the biggest bang for our buck, that's why it's really important when we think of monitoring this for athletes. Because if we don't have good oxidative processes, chances are the PCR is not going to be replenished, and then the structure of the cells might not be in the ready state. And when we think about hard training and increasing density of training, or even getting in training and these hard, hectic schedules that some of these field and court sport athletes have, we need to make sure the oxidation process is always intact. So, order of operations when we just think of this process. We know that glycogenolysis and glycolysis feeds into the oxidative process, okay? So, don't think that they're all just off on their own little island. They all feed into each other, all right? Now, some people always ask me, okay, then what stops the oxidation process? Well, a little bit. If we start, the cell senses that we might be coming into a little bit of trouble in the sense of that O2 threshold, that quarter of a tank left, if that's been observed in that athlete, then the oxidative process can then slow down a little bit. Another thing that can also slow it down is water. We actually need low H2O in a cell. I know that might be contrary to what most people think, but if you ever looked at, I think it's electron microscopy, or I always mess up that word, but if you'd start looking at tissue in that sense, you can see that the protein structure of a cell is vast, and the water in between the protein structure is very little. And so every time that you see water being infiltrated into a cell, glycolysis will be uptaked and be performing its job at a higher frequency. And mainly that's just because the glycolytic enzymes are a little bit more soluble in water than the oxidative enzymes, okay? And we've all experienced this, especially if you're in the strength conditioning field. If we're out there doing a bodybuilding routine and I'm doing a bunch of bicep curls, and all of a sudden I get swole, I get that feeling of water coming in, right? That's also a signal for the fact that we've stimulated that metabolic process. We have water coming in. That signal of using O2, creating like a metabolic stress, also gives a signal for growth, all right? But when we think of having athletes not fatigue, right, we need to make sure that the delivery system of O2 is in, that PCR is doing its job, and that the O2 in the cell is out, right? And the way that O2 leaves the cell, CO2. CO2 helps drag water out of the cell, and it's a byproduct of oxidation. Hence the reason why oxidation is so important, okay? It's the same thing that we think of when it comes to trying to recover athletes as well, or if there's injuries, right? Since CO2 is a Lewis acid, it can actually drag O2 out. So if I hit somebody's hand with a hammer and it was swollen, and I wrapped it in a plastic bag real quick and pumped CO2 gas in, chances are the swelling would go down, right? And then you would start seeing moisture in the bag. CO2 has a good ability of doing this. And I think that's what keeps the cyclical process of oxidation going, okay? But if you go too fast and oxidation can't keep up, O2 comes in, CO2 is not being produced as much, then the glycogenolysis, or specifically glycolysis, will have to run a little bit faster. Now, this model just isn't from a sports science standpoint. This is actually from even a health standpoint. They're one-to-one. They're not different things. They're the same thing, okay? So here's just an easy way of looking at it. Instead of that old traditional model, we just need to just look at it in the sense of just O2, and then maybe some of the byproducts, or not the byproducts, but the substrates in the sense of glycolysis or glycogen, and then glucose, okay? So no matter what we do, we always have glycogen or glucose or just carbohydrates in general being used, right? It's just that it's feeding into the O2, and O2 is there, right? And so then as O2 decreases, right, you see power decrease. So if we're just running off of glycolysis, that last, say, that last 5 seconds of that 20-second bout, power output will be lower, right? But if we go right at the 10-second mark, power output will probably be a little bit higher, right? So as long as we have O2, power can be generated, all right? This is just the easiest way to look at it. Now, when we think of this from the marathon, it's the same idea. Like I said, it's the same thing. O2 is going to be used, right? And then as you fatigue, you're going to start going through, obviously, probably more glucose, because glycogen is probably, unless you've been filling it back up, you're going to be going through glucose. What's interesting about these type of athletes is that you'll see a O2, say, threshold for them at a little bit higher percentage, okay? And there's many reasons why, but probably the biggest reason is that in the marathon, you're not going to do utilization type exercises, right? You can also dictate this as well, especially in the endurance field, is that the athletes that can utilize, right, means that you probably have the ability to kick later on, right? And maybe a little bit more neurological efficiency to recruit some of those fibers that will kind of drain O2, okay, to utilize. Or in some marathoners, they don't use that, right? But this also can think of pacing strategies as well, right? If I have a lower utilization threshold than somebody else, then that means I'm probably I have a little bit more aerobic capacity, and I can push the pace early, right? And so even doing these assessments on all type of athletes, you can start seeing how their innate ability and how they race and kind of marry the two. So like I told you guys before, at the end of the day, I want you guys to really look at this in the sense of how to think about it. And here's just one of the basic principles of how I look at Moxy. Now, there's a scientist, I think back in the 40s or 30s, his name's J.C. Bose. He figured out that when he stimulated a nerve, that's the a plant, which is the P, and metal, which is the M, he started getting these response curves, okay? Now, this is very interesting because when we stimulate athletes and we have a Moxy on, we see the same type of curves, right? So here's a basic principle of just even material physics, or probably just of us in this universe, is the fact that when you stimulate inorganic or organic material, it's going to show you a mobilization of energy. Now, why does that matter? And why does it matter for sport athletes? Well, like I told you before, their schedules are hectic, right? They have multiple games. We have to still get training in, but they still need to be able to perform what they need to do. So if I can watch Moxy and make sure the athlete doesn't fatigue, right, then chances are I'm not going to have structural damage, or as much structural damage as if I just picked a workout off of a book and just applied that to that athlete. Because J.C. Bose showed that when you stimulate inorganic or organic material, it gives you you should see a stimulus and response. And in material physics, when it comes to metal, it's just like if we started bending, okay, a pliable metal, there'd be mobilization of energy. Now, when that metal fatigues, which metal does fatigue, it'll start cracking and break, okay? And so as I kind of go through some of these slides, you'll see that the stimulus and response curves, very similar to Moxy, okay? Here is a nerve, a plant, and metal. And this is stimulus, but where's the response? We start seeing the response decrease, right? And in the plant, when they've poisoned the plant or when they've stimulated the plant to the point of fatigue, there is structural damage. The same thing happens with metal, and also, obviously, the biological process of stimulating a nerve. And so that brings us to this. This is a HIIT protocol that I made my intern do, even though we would cut him off if this was an athlete showing these graphs. We just kept her going, okay, for the sake of science. And as we can see, this stimulus and response is different, right? We see that she can't load O2. So what does she probably have? A respiratory limitation, right? Or at least a delivery limitation. Here, the same thing, utilization, right? We're not seeing the athlete utilize as it did before. So in this case, what would we usually do? We would cut the athlete off. Why? Because maybe they have a game on Saturday, right? We still want to get hard training in, but then after the athlete starts showing signs of fatigue, we want to cut them off because we want to make sure that there is enough energy that the structure can still go back and be in the ready state. If you fatigue structure too much, you lose the ready state and you have a more chaotic state. This leads us to the model that we really try to ram home to all of our consultations, or any of our athletes or coaches that we come in contact with, is that the cyclical wheel, that energetics, okay, you have to have energy to build the structure, right? In other words, you have to have ATP to get the structure into the ready state. And we can think of that even right now, in the sense that when you have life, right now, we can flex our bicep, correct? But for some reason, one of us dropped dead, hopefully not, but if we did, then after a period of time, ATP would go bye-bye, and we would be in a state of rigor, right? In that state of rigor, we don't have energy to kind of load the gun to put us in the ready state. All right. And so once structure's in the ready state, it can then perform a function. And it's just luckily that in our biology, that once the function happens and once you stimulate a cell, an energetic process happens, which then again comes up and loads the structure. It's a cyclical pattern, right? But if the energetics aren't there and then the structure isn't there, you're not going to have function. And so that is the cyclical wheel that we always look at when we think of speed and power athletes and how our interventions are going to be played when it comes into kind of sneaking in good training on these terrible performance calendars that they have.
Hey, Aaron, I'm going to jump in with a question here.
Yeah, shoot.
Are there situations where you would not want to avoid the structural damage, where you would actually want to have structural damage in a controlled way, trying to create growth?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about it in the sense of, even with like bodybuilders, we've got to consult with maybe one of the upcoming bodybuilders that's coming up, but that sport's a little bit different in the sense of nutrition and supplementation. But we use Moxy in the sense of making sure that we desatted completely in certain muscle groups, and that dictated a lot of our sets and reps initially, but there is times to do that, to keep O2 even really, really low and stimulate that, because you're going to get a good response as long as the athlete's healthy. And specifically in that bodybuilder, we knew we could get away with it. But in high performance times and when the calendar's packed, generally we stay away from it unless we have maybe a little bit more runway.
Okay, great. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for Aaron, you can type them in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. All
right. So here's the old school way, I think, and I know most people on Moxy, they come from the endurance background, and I did myself as a runner. And so this is very familiar in the sense that when we think of conditioning, we want to always build up volume first, keep intensity low, and then throughout the season, we want to kind of have them cross and have intensity up towards more of the peaking phase and volume down. All I'm saying is that with Moxy is that we can actually fit in these high intensity workouts without this accumulated high volume load early. And the only reason why I say that is that because, one, it's not the reality of the training for these sports anyways. We don't get these periods that we can do this, but we can still sneak in good quality training, right? Much of kind of how the new periodization and much how most strength and conditioning or coaches have to operate now with these schedules. And we can do this because we can monitor the whole time, all right? This is just the reverse periodization plan. Now, granted, these blocks can be extended further out, but generally when we look at athletes, this is kind of how we look at things. Speed and coordination come first, and then we extend out, and then we increase both volume and endurance as we go on. Because at the end of the day, it's power output that pays the bills. If power output is not going up, it doesn't matter how conditioned they are, right? If they can't be faster than the guy next to them, or more explosive, then they're not going to get their spot on the team, and they're definitely not going to get the scholarships or the accolades that they might need or what they're going for. So obviously when we look at Moxy, we know that we're monitoring muscle, lungs, heart in that process, okay? So that's when it comes down to, for us, when we think of programming for these athletes, is that we have to find their limiter, okay? And we're going to stay on their limiter a lot and really make sure that that limiter gets resolved before we just throw any and every workout at them. Now, this is from Martin Boucher, just kind of stole from him and kind of altered it just slightly, because generally when we have the strength conditioning coaches, they generally take research or take these protocols that have been researched, and then they just layer it on their athlete. Now, when we look at this, though, we can then start seeing what system or what processes are happening along this kind of interval spectrum and see what's actually being stimulated. right? So to your far right, we have sprint interval training, right? This is very, very fast with a lot of rest. You're mostly going to see it, depending on the time duration of the sprint, it's mostly going to be a neurological or coordination issue, okay? That's what you're trying to stimulate, right? High power, high speed. Metabolic utilization is obviously going to come in there if we start going outside, maybe that like 6 or 7 second realm. You'll start seeing huge utilization, and that's going to dictate a lot of the speed or speed endurance qualities. The repeated sprint training or protocols that we see happening in soccer, right? A lot of times coaches just layer this type of training on. But if you're doing a repeat sprint test and the athlete has a very poor respiratory system, then they're not going to reload, right? And so then if they're not going to reload SMO2, then their performance is going to start to lack. Now, we can just keep on hitting them over the head with repeat sprint training, right? And we can just keep on, and they might improve just a little bit. But if you just take time, improve the respiratory system, and then just even test again, you'll see bigger gains much faster and not at the expense of the adaptation process from the athlete, okay? And so as we move across the spectrum, you can start seeing that at the top, you can start seeing probably what might be the limitation, what might be contributing to what's happening with the athlete, okay? And so if you don't get anything from this, just realize that exploring the limiters and finding out what they are and creating good interventions around them will help more than layering on some of these cookbook ideas in the sense of training with all the athletes. And at the very least, it'll keep the athlete, if we're monitoring them within these condition parameters, it'll keep these athletes ready to go and performing at a higher level. So here's just kind of my menu when it comes to conditioning. You'll see like the stimulus, obviously via time, sets, and reps. Realize that that is a little bit in the gray area because we're monitoring the whole time, right? We just generally don't just say, hey, I want you to do this. We're usually looking at what the reaction tells us. So at the end of the day, the reaction is going to give us a little bit more info than just my stopwatch. And then on the far right is just the adaptation that we use, or the adaptation that we're maybe going after. Now, this is my full menu that we use, but generally when we think of just field and court sport athletes, we usually just use this. And the respiratory workouts aren't listed, but I'll be honest, we use that all the time now. And a lot of this, even if you guys are familiar with Brian Kozak, you know, a lot of this has been stuff that, you know, he's helped me with. And then even on some of this is that even though this looks very standard, we have to think of what the athlete actually needs. So every athlete might need a different recipe, right? So maybe an athlete might need to do a little bit more cardiac work because of the limiter, or maybe they need to do a little bit more of the desaturation for the utilization, right? And when we think of just even the O2 intensive desaturation, which is probably used the most, right? In the sense of that we start the athlete, we warm them up to the highest SMO2 achievable, then we have them go as hard as possible down to whatever their utilization threshold is, and then have them come back up. And then we just yo-yo that or kind of roller coaster that throughout the whole session. Now, the twist that we've put on this with speed and power athletes or just field and court athletes is that we now use broken sets. So before you would just string those along, right? You might get like 10 to 20 of those reps of just waiting for the athlete to recover and then go again. Now, because we want to focus on more of the neurological side and we want to make sure that they're fast, we might only do 4 or 5 of those reps and then give them bigger breaks, right? And at certain points of the year, especially when we want them to be their fastest, right? Or have the most power or power endurance, we're going to do more broken set type work because at the end of the day, even though conditioning is great and having them have huge engines, speed and power always rule. And so even though this is a very standard menu, realize that they are short or like little nuances that we will add to improve the stimulus that we want to give for the athlete. And that is it. So I will take questions if you have them.
Thanks, Aaron. That was great. Reminder again, if you have questions, go ahead and type those in on the comment box. So we have one here. Aaron, could you explain a little bit how you apply the Moxy in basketball, testing protocols, etc.?
Well, it kind of just depends. We again take off a lot from Brian Kozak in the sense of his, and even on the forum you can hear about it, but his RIP protocol. So at the end of the day, we always have about a 20-second interval that we want to test from. Now, depending on the athlete, generally when we go and if we do, if we're going to consult, some of the coaches don't necessarily want us to put them on the court because they're on the court all the time. And so we sometimes have to go on bikes, right? But realize that the bike's going to give you a different stimulus. You're going to have more of something that's called velocity fatigue. So as somebody starts spinning fast, the faster they go, they don't have enough time to push power down, right? And so there's different things that we have to kind of look at when you think of testing those athletes. But generally we do a 20-second test. They rest for about 1 minute and 40 seconds, and then they repeat those intervals, you know, as many times as you need to kind of get a good sense of what's going on. In other cases, we'll put them on the court where they sprint, shuffle, and just so we can kind of get an idea of what it looks like in real time.
Okay, the next one, how do you detect the O2 utilization threshold?
We pretty much put it, you know, if it's, you know, obviously if we think of, say an endurance athlete, we put them on a treadmill, do a step test to the point where they pretty much fatigue, right? And we start seeing where they can't, where the body starts fatiguing, even though they have maybe a higher amount of SMO2 still in the muscle. And generally, depending on the time of year, on some of the athletes, they're doing maybe half or full marathon training. Depending on the characteristics, maybe we want to improve that, or you know, and that's where I think if we look at some of the maybe the best marathon coaches, Renato Canova, he always used this reverse periodization model because he was doing fast stuff even very, very early on, and so he always kept utilization, I think, pretty high as he built this extension or as he built capacity on all of his athletes. And so if we can just use that step test to just give us an idea of what the athlete's doing, and then we can obviously use Moxy for the great interventions to make sure that they're reaction based. They're just not, you know, something I came up off of a book. Then that'll help.
Okay, just kind of a follow-up on that. How do you determine how to baseline test for different sports?
We just look at, so you can do everything. So we can do the endurance type tests where we can maybe step test. We can do the high intensity test. But I think if we actually look at the demands of most of these field and court sport athletes, we know that there is a explosive or speed factor in that they have to utilize energy very fast and they have to recover very fast as well. And so I think that the high intensity test is by far the way to go, at least in my mind, in the sense of if speed kills, then we have to have an element of that in our conditioning protocol when we test.
How close do you try to match what they actually do in the sport? Is that important?
In some cases, if we have a full runway, I would rather just do that. So in other words, like if it's not going to interfere with anything in their season or what their coaches are trying to accomplish, then I will try to get it as close as possible for sure. But even then, if we think of some of the characteristics, let's say even on a bike, like I told you before, on a bike where the resistance, you know, you can start spinning really, really fast. And that velocity fatigue, right? In the sense where you can't really produce much power because you're spinning so fast, that can kind of give us an idea a little bit more so about how their coordination is. So in other words, you're stimulating the coordination ability of the muscle to contract and relax very fast. And so maybe that can give us some insight as well, but realize that it's there, that it's maybe a little bit different than what they're experiencing in their stride frequency when they sprint, run, or if they're on a basketball court.
Okay. The next question is related to cycling. Is it possible to start working with one sensor in cycling applications, or do you have to start with 3 sensors?
you just have to start with one. Like at the end of the day, when coaches come up or athletes come up, I say just start with one. Figure out what you're seeing underneath one sensor, and then you can go on to the other sensors. But one's going to get the job done. Now, when we test, generally we have multiple sensors on, and that's just well, I'm greedy, so I want to know everything, right? And so we even use other technologies included with the Moxy, just to give us a little bit more feedback.
Okay, the next one. If an athlete can't deliver O2, but Moxy shows that blood flow isn't a limitation, why is this a respiratory issue? Does this have to do with pH?
Can't deliver O2. Moxy shows good blood flow. Yeah, I mean, so if it's pH, if you think of just like in the sense that if even with athletes that are maybe more fast twitch or maybe more explosive, they can generate quite a bit of energy, and chances are they're probably going to generate it maybe a little bit more from the glycolytic side. And so here's the play. Those CO2s produced via oxidation. Hydrogen obviously is being a byproduct as well, and so you will have more of an acidic environment maybe in the blood. And so for you to blow off, right? So you have to blow off CO2 or hydrogen from the red blood cell, so that way you can actually load O2 back on the red blood cell. And so when we see blood flow increasing, right? Blood flow might increase from a cardiac standpoint, but it could also be increasing from a vasodilation from the CO2. And if there is more CO2 in the blood, right, that's accompanying those spots on the hemoglobin, then O2 can't get in. That's why the respiratory and being able to offload CO2 is incredibly important.
Okay, the last one we have here is, in the context of acyclical sports, will you still assess SpO2, FVC ratios, respiratory rates in conjunction with Moxy? I think you started on that a little bit earlier, but
yeah, no, always. Yeah, we let's put it this way: I'm still dumb enough where I don't know everything, so I take in everything. So at the end of the day, like we do everything you can possibly imagine to get in more info, and then hopefully as I get older, we'll start narrowing down to what really matters.
Okay, one more here. Do you do CO2 tolerance training?
Yeah, we do. We use the Spire Tiger, and we do different protocols to elicit that in our athletes. We also have to think of that CO2 tolerance. Tolerance is one thing, which is good in the sense of the chemoreceptors, but then you have to think of what CO2 actually does from a physical standpoint. Even when we have exhausted nerve cells, right? So we have overexcitation of a nerve from the calcium. If you give somebody an altitude protocol or a hypoxic protocol, it'll actually relax the nervous system. So even when we think of having athletes that come in with pain or different things like that, we use CO2 protocols to maybe put them in a better state, to maybe relax the tissue or the nervous system. So yeah, we do CO2 tolerance. We probably use CO2 more than most people would expect.
Okay. I'll get a couple more coming in here. How are you measuring respiratory rate, and how do you determine whether it's a strength, endurance, or coordination problem for the respiratory system?
Yeah, in some cases, mostly it's like the Zephyr. So we can use the Zephyr unit as one way to look at the respiratory frequency. Old school way I used to do it was just counting after all the rest during the rest periods. We now are using, or will be using, sorry, we have the Neuroxin Altium device now, where you can just put on the rib cage and you can get heart rate and respiratory rate. It's just a very little small device that can sit right there. And if we look at from how do we determine like strength, endurance, or coordination on the respiratory system, just realize that we're always training coordination, right? Like from a neurological side and from even a strength and conditioning perspective, we know that the nervous system can adapt maybe the fastest. So we should always be pushing that, both in speed, on the court, or jumping, or just their skill coordination, or just the respiratory coordination. It's all the same thing. So coordination probably for us is always being somewhat hit upon. And then when we think of like the strength side, I look at it more from a structural standpoint. So when we think of doing respiratory strength type work or mobilization of the rib cage, if we look at the athletes that we generally work with, which is the field and court sport athletes, if you actually look at their infrasternal angle, and I don't know if you guys can see, but if you actually go into the rib cage and up to the xiphoid process, right, and you can see how narrow that is. Now, if they have a narrow rib cage, then tidal volume of breathing might be a little bit difficult, right? But what's so great about doing the strength training, specifically on a Spiro-Tiger, right? It gives you pressure back in to balloon up, right? So if you think of that umbrella term when it comes to breathing mechanics, you know, inhale, exhale. It gives us an opportunity to train that and mobilize the rib cage, right? And even though breathing exercises and stuff are all out there now and everybody, you know, tries to, you know, do it, the great thing about having Moxy is that it's actually changing your physiology, right? So what is your resting SMO2 as you do these these breathing exercises? Because sometimes you might be doing them and they might not be doing anything. It might be a good sensory feedback for the athlete, but it's not changing anything day to day. But what we're seeing is that if we can do respiratory breathing exercises to also change posture, then the next day we might actually see loaded or a little bit higher loaded gas tank of SMO2, right? And that's a physiological adaptation that we're trying to get at. And so, you know, when we look at identifying that, right, we put people on the table and we do different, you know, orthopedic assessments. And then we also have, you know, the Moxy test that we do. And then if from the endurance side, from the respiratory, you know, generally we see that if we start doing the actual training and we start seeing the later time durations start being an issue, then we'll focus on it, right? But at the end of the day, it's really just identifying what is actually the limiter, and not just the limiter in the sense of the test, but just even throughout training, what you're seeing every day, and then adjust accordingly.
Okay, awesome presentation, Aaron. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. If anyone would like to continue the discussion on this, we will be posting a recording on our forum. The recording will also be available on the training tab on the website. So thank you everyone for attending, and we will let you know when we have our next webinar scheduled.
Thanks, guys.